Ethereum validators are such an asset because they are already running super high performance setups. And we can translate that into doing more things for Ethereum, not just staking. And so imagine bringing all of that capacity and experience to do things which are traditionally done by a centralized entity, but we can actually do that even better than the centralized entity because we're already doing it better in staking. And so the natural progression of staking is towards things like base rollups and pre-confirmations, which are kind of very complementary, or not even complementary, they're kind of pivotal to Ethereum, but they're complementary in the sense that there's a few ways to do that. And if you use the right tool, you can get better results. And so I think that it's very natural for validators to go into those places. And if we can get to that, the added value is for the entire Ethereum. It's not just for the individual validator. Validators that do more, especially in the rollup world, are making better rollups. You can drive value back to Ethereum holders because you can then drive a lot of the activity of Ethereum back to the actual Ethereum holder. And there's not a lot of other chains that have so much activity. And so this effect of expanding what validators do, but also make Ethereum better and drive value back to Ethereum is quite remarkable. And I think Ethereum validators are in this unique position that no other group of entities or individual actors can actually do and achieve because they're so well organized within Ethereum. Like think about it, 1.1 million validators. That's a large city of coordinating every 12 seconds. That's incredible. And so if you can extend that to services Ethereum has, which is ordering blocks and providing confirmation for transactions and scaling and all of that, I think the effects are well beyond just staking on Ethereum. The effects are on Ethereum itself and its future and its competitiveness against other blockchains, which are, scaled, but in a different way. We can scale in a way that preserves what Ethereum is, which is decentralized, credibly neutral, censorship resistant. And we can use the biggest asset we have, which are the validators themselves.
I always love asking founders about how they think about their competitive landscape, because I think there's an incredible amount of nuance in a lot of these categories. I would love to get your sense of what does the sort of competitive staking landscape look like, both at the, let's just call it the macro level of staking within Ethereum. And then if you want to go down into DVT specifically, I think that might be the right way to tackle it. I'm going to sort of leave it to you as somebody who lives and breathes this category to maybe educate the audience on how you see the landscape.
I think that our biggest challenge is really, if you think about it, there's a certain way to do staking for the last 4 years, right? And we came up with a new way, and we want to convert people because we believe this is a better choice technically and also for kind of the greater Ethereum. And so the biggest challenge is to just convince people, even if you offer additional rewards, it's just convincing them to move, and that takes time. And so I think that we started amazingly, but in order to get to that goal where I said before, in 2 to 5 years, most of Ethereum validators are running on SSV or DVT, I think that's a process that is going to be very, very challenging. Now, I think that can be accelerated if we can obviously offer additional rewards, because that's really what drives the entire industry. But also like fundamental things like client diversity. At a certain point, that becomes a major thing because you're going to grow to be so big that, if you don't do those types of things, you're going to be threatening Ethereum itself, because then, with all the hard work people did with client diversity on Ethereum and multiple implementation and so on, then everything is driven back to one implementation. That's not good. So that's the biggest challenge. And I think the competition is mostly on that front. How do you go to the next big exchange, the next big institution? How do you go to the ETFs, which are about to, in the next 6 months, probably launch staking, and they will be a major stakeholder in staking in Ethereum? How do you convince them to start with DVT? Because if they're too big and they're doing it in a centralized way and they are have a major stake in place, they can actually affect Ethereum. And so that's, I think, the biggest challenge we have. Now, in terms of competition, we do have competition, but we're quite bigger than the second biggest DVT out there, somewhere around the 7x or 8x bigger than them. And I think actually our competition is not just with DVT or staking, is the idea that, again, validators have this very competitive nature of getting these extra rewards in any way they can. And so that's really the challenge. And so in that sense, we're competing with DeFi, we're competing with restaking, we're competing with other ecosystems as well.
Very helpful. And, when you think about the companies or the constituencies that have the most to lose if SSV is wildly successful? Who do you think those constituencies are? From your perspective, how are they trying to sort of ward off the threat of becoming irrelevant? Or how are they thinking about being or participating as part of where this could go technologically?
Well, our competitors have the biggest thing to lose, right? I mean, if we get too big for them to catch up, then that's an end game for them. But I think that with DVT specifically, it's not about winning or losing. You're creating this new middle layer of infrastructure for Ethereum. So it's not about really winning or losing. I think that if you're doing it right, you're preserving the ethos of Ethereum and the properties of Ethereum alongside presenting a really great use case for what you want to do. I think it's definitely a win-win situation. There's not necessarily somebody that needs to lose in order for us to win. But I think that's short term. I think long term, it's much more about what else can you give those validators. And so I think that's where it's going to turn into, okay, we're going to compete more than just staking here. We're going to compete with others, and there potentially you can take market share, which others are not expecting. And so I've kind of hinted towards based rollups, for example, but I definitely think that's a potential avenue. I mean, I personally think that there is a place for brand names to launch rollups like Coinbase and WorldChain and Sony and others. But the idea that most of the interaction with Ethereum will be through a centralized sequencer owned by a company that controls everything around it, I think that's not a great future that I want to see Ethereum go through. And so in that sense, based rollups, which are driven by validators, will take a market share. And their market share, by definition, will come at the expense of the other type of category. Even though you can always argue that because rollups are growing quite rapidly, it's a growing market. So it's not necessarily you're taking from others, you're just taking a market share, but everyone is growing. But in that sense, I do think SSV and others have something to compete with existing markets which did things in a certain way. And potentially there's another way to do that.
And when you think about Ethereum specifically, if it becomes sort of fully modularized, does validator infrastructure, in your opinion, become even more important? Or does it become like less important because of that modular nature?
If you want to boil down Ethereum to a service or a couple of services, what would you say what types of services Ethereum offers today?
Well, just validator services, right?
Well, Ethereum as a blockchain, it offers settlement, right? You can
Settlement,
settle, and data availability, right?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, it's a feature, but you can settle on smart contracts, right? So that's settlement and data availability. That's basically what it does, right? Now, there's a third type of service Ethereum can offer through its validators, which is sequencing, or the idea that it can order transactions and operate rollups outside of just the native Ethereum chain. And so those are the services that Ethereum can offer. And so in that sense, I think there's a major shift happening. It's not just what we think Ethereum is. Ethereum is evolving as well. And if you want to boil down what Ethereum is, ultimately, the Ethereum state is held by 1.1 million validators. If those 1.1 million validators decides Ethereum is something else, then Ethereum is something else. There's nothing anyone else can do about it. And so I definitely think that validators now offering settlement and data availability will be offering sequencing as well. And that basically means that Ethereum validators will touch every single transactions or the majority of transactions from the rollup side and from the Ethereum side, store the data for them, and also provide this settlement layer where everything settles back. So Ethereum validators will become a much more meaningful part of Ethereum, I think, as we go along. It's kind of like, think about it as AI and Nvidia, right? AI is the application, right? It's a type of service, right? There's a bunch of different ways to go about doing that. But ultimately, all of those services require hardware. They cannot do anything without this hardware. And so regardless of how big OpenAI will be, the hardware operating it will always be bigger. I've read recently a really interesting article that showed the size of AWS versus the biggest applications that build on top of it. And AWS is quite significantly bigger than them. even though the applications built on top of it are huge. Think of the biggest services you can think of in Web 2, right? And I think similar things will happen with the validators of Ethereum. It doesn't really matter how big the application will be. The validation layer or the Ethereum infrastructure will be bigger than that always, because it has to support whatever comes next. So whatever the biggest rollup will be, whatever the biggest ICO will be, whatever the biggest airdrop will be, the infrastructure will always be bigger. And so now I think with adding this additional service to validators on Ethereum also goes to show that that staking and validation evolves, and it's not static. It's not one thing anymore. It evolves quite rapidly. So that's an interesting observation in of its own in a place that you wouldn't necessarily expect it at all.